As Genevieve Williams is making the last, she is, of course, representing Afro Resistance, one of our major co-sponsors, and she will speak for herself. As she's doing that, let me just take this moment to thank everyone who is coming into this very, very important conversation. I made a pledge today to start all of my public discussions with a recognition and acknowledgement of the political prisoners that we have in the United States of America. As some of you may know, Delbert Africa, who was part of the Move 9 that spent more than 4 decades in the dungeons of this criminal state, was released in January, only to have passed a day or so ago. And it just brought into relief the untold story of this state, a state that has more political prisoners serving 4 and 5 decades than any other nation state on this planet. And so we want to hold up our freedom fighters and remind the world of them and hold them in a special space as we go forward in this tremendous struggle that we're involved in. Let me say that we want to acknowledge the main co-sponsor of this event. I mentioned Afro Resistance, a new collective, a dynamic collective of primarily African descended women doing some outstanding work. The Black for the development of the Black Alliance. Am I still frozen? Do you hear me?
We hear you now.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. And so you heard me say something about Afro resistance, right?
Yes, but I can go ahead now so I can give the instructions for interpretation, because and then
then I come back and finish.
You can maybe repeat yourself because there's still a lot of people coming in to the meeting as well.
Okay.
So welcome everybody. My name is Genevieve Williams Comrie. I am the executive director of Afro Resistance. Afro Resistance, it was known before as the Latin American and Caribbean Community Center, and Ajamu was one of our founding board members, and this was almost 15 years ago. And we have transitioned into Afro Resistance because we have always centered race, right, within immigrant rights and within social justice. But in order to be really intentional about our stance around our people, we changed our name to Afro Resistance. And the mission of Afro Resistance is to organize and educate around racial justice and human rights, both in the United States, but also in Latin America and the Caribbean in regards to the diaspora. We're not majority Black women from Latin America. We're 100% Black women from Latin America and the Caribbean. And we intentionally take stands around human rights, social justice, and reproductive justice, with racial justice, of course, being what holds us up. We are really invested, as Black Alliance for Peace is invested in us, because we see that we can't talk about liberation without really upholding, the fight against militarizations, the fight against the terrorism that we face as African people throughout the globe. So thank you, Ajamu, for for leading, for leading collective organizing, which Black Alliance for Peace is. And I want to welcome everybody that is here for this really important conversation. In regards to interpretation, interpretation is being held in English and in Spanish. How that is working is that we have, when presenters speak in French, right? And I'm gonna ask the interpreters that are with us today to repeat this in French, so that folks that need interpretation into English understand as well. When the presenters are speaking in French, if you do not understand French, there's a button that will show up once I finish finish explaining, that will say interpretation. And that's on the three little buttons on the right-hand side of your image of where you are. And you select the language English. You will still see the speaker's video, but you will hear simultaneous interpretation into French. You must mute yourself, of course, but also you must select off to listen to the original audio if you want to come back to the main room. If you're using a cell phone, follow the exact same steps. Click on the three dots on the right labeled More, select Interpretation, you mute the original audio, and you select English, right? If the speaker is speaking in French. But you don't forget to mute the original audio so you hear only the interpretation. And I'll repeat this several times as needed throughout the conversation, because I know folks, we do this all the time and folks forget sometimes how it works, or people that are coming in might not have heard these instructions. So right now, I want to really thank Seydou Sai, Eugene, and Astania for really, for holding down interpretation. And if one of you could interpret or translate what the instructions that I just said. Eugene? Eugene, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes.
So Eugene, for interpretation, if you could explain to folks that might not understand English, that in order to hear English translations, they have to click the three dots on the right-hand side of their screen and click French.
Okay. So I speak in French. It's for those who don't understand English that want to hear in
Correct.
French, right? Okay.
Correct.
Bonsoir tout le monde. En fait, ce que Geneviève est en train de dire, il y a une option pour ceux qui ne parlent pas anglais. Vous verrez en bas de votre écran, il y aura anglais et français. Il vous suffit d'appuyer français de telle manière à ce que vous puissiez suivre tous les débats. Quand les gens parlent en anglais, vous devez être sur la motion français. Comme ça, vous écouterez celui qui traduit en français. Je vous remercie. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start the French rooms. Maintenant. Okay. And interpretation, start. Okay.
Let me know when I should finish.
So those of you, les personnes qui n'entendent pas de l'anglais, maintenant vous pourrez hacer clic on les trois dots et accéder les chambres pour les français, pour les anglais.
I knew you were really French.
I forgot. All right, so I think we're good. Go ahead, Jamal. And please, for the speakers,
Okay.
remember that there's interpretation happening. So please do it really slow.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
And everybody should be muted.
Everybody needs
Except for
to be
me.
muted.
Even interpreters.
Okay, so let me go ahead and finish up my a couple of minutes so we can get into the meat of the program and why we're here. I wanted to just finish with letting people know the other co-sponsors. We talked about the two main ones, Afro Resistance and the Pan-African Community Action. We also want to mention the Ujima Peoples.
Go ahead, Ajamu.
It looks like his screen is frozen again.
Oh.
We also want to we also want to mention the Ujima People's Progress Party, the Black Workers for Justice, the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Bases, the United National Anti-War Coalition, the Institute for Policy Studies, Stop the Machine, Create a New World, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the African World Now Project, the All African People's Revolutionary Pan-African Socialists, that are representing the Black Alliance for Peace. The mission of this alliance that was born April the 4th, 2017, is quite simple. It is to revive the traditional radical Black internationalism, to recenter the struggle against the pan-European colonial capitalist white supremacist patriarchy as the number one enemy that face African people. It is an alliance for the U.S. and African people worldwide, and all people who are struggling against this colonial capitalist system. The tagline of the Black Alliance for Peace is that we are a people-centered a human rights project. Again, we're quite clear. We have a campaign ongoing now, the No Compromise, No Retreat campaign, to defeat the war against African people in the United States and abroad. A part of that campaign is the campaign to close or to shut down Africa. That came out of a new coalition we helped to create, targeting the U.S. Command structures, the structures the U.S. Imperialist state put in place in order to perpetuate and advance their global hegemony. We say quite clearly that those command structures have to be shut down, and in particular, the U.S. Africa Command. We recognize that demand requires struggle, because not only do we have to deal with the supporters of AFRICOM internally, but we have to deal with the neo-colonial forces on the African continent that are in alliance with AFRICOM. June 16th is Soweto Day, and we say that today is the day that we reaffirm our commitment to shut down AFRICOM. We say rise up to shut down AFRICOM on this day. So thank all of you for joining us. And we will go forward with the program.
Great, thank you, Ajamu. I ask that everyone stop their video and stay on mute just for ease of identifying the presenters today. And by the way, my name is Tunde. I am the coordinator of the Black Alliance for Peace's U.S. Out of Africa Network. It's a network that organizes to accomplish the ends of the U.S. Out of Africa campaign. And we're excited to have you all on here. We have a great list of presenters, and I will be introducing first Margaret Kimberley, who is a co-founder, editor, and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report. She's the author of Presidential, Black America and the President.
Videos first.
And my apologies. We'll be showing a video from the Peace Report about AFRICOM before we get to the presenters. So stay tuned. This is a really great 7-minute video, just chronicling the rise of AFRICOM over the past, 12 years. So Netfa, could you share the video, please?
"10 years of AFRICOM." AFRICOM stands for the United States Africa Command, a full-spectrum combatant command. U.S. AFRICOM is responsible for all U.S. Department of Defense operations, exercises, and security cooperation on the African continent, its island nations, and surrounding waters. Mission statement of AFRICOM. United States Africa Command, with partners, disrupts and neutralizes transnational threats, protects U.S. personnel and facilities, prevents and mitigates conflict, and builds African partner defense capability and capacity in order to promote regional security, stability, and prosperity. AFRICOM timeline. 2007. The Bush administration announces that it will establish the first U.S. African command structure, AFRICOM. Libya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe denounced the concept, with most other African nations soon taking a similar stand. 2008. President Bush visits Africa and encounters near unanimous rejection of his AFRICOM plan. Only Libya showed an interest in hosting the AFRICOM headquarters. Since its inception, AFRICOM has been based in Stuttgart, Germany. Despite fierce opposition from many African states, AFRICOM is established on October 1st, 2008, but forced to maintain its headquarters in Stuttgart, Germany. 2009, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, the elected president of the African Union, continues African opposition to basing AFRICOM in Africa. 2011, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973 authorizes a no-fly zone in Libya. NATO forces, led by the US, France, and United Kingdom, quickly violate the agreement and embark on a bombing campaign with an intent to change the government of Libya. After a massive bombing campaign in support of right-wing Islamic forces by the US and NATO, Gaddafi and remaining government forces are surrounded in the city of Sirte, where he is captured and brutally murdered in October. 2012. Captured Libyan arms are deployed to various armed groups, including Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb. The result is enhanced military capacities of Boko Haram in Nigeria, civil war in Mali, destabilization and armed conflict in Central African Republic, Chad, Niger, and dismembering of Libya. AFRICOM trained soldier Captain Amadou Sanogo led a coup in Mali that overthrew a democratically elected government. 2014. Estimated between 5,000 to 8,000 U.S. troops in Africa. The U.S. carried out 674 military missions across the continent, an average of nearly 2 per day, and an increase of about 300% since U.S. Africa Command was launched in 2008. The U.S. carried out 674 military missions across the continent, an average of nearly 2 per day, and an increase of about 300% since U.S. Africa Command was launched in 2008. 2015. AFRICOM trained soldier General Gilbert Diandere led a coup in Burkina Faso. A report was surfaced in 2015 that revealed the forms of U.S. military presence in Africa. U.S. military presence is divided into 3 categories of basing. First, forward operating sites. Second, cooperative security locations. Third, contingency locations. Another category for measuring U.S. military presence is the military-to-military cooperative agreements with various African states. 2016, 46 bases, a network now consisting of 2 forward operating sites, 13 cooperative security locations, and 31 contingency locations. Many of the military-to-military partnerships, which the command has with 53 of Africa's 54 states, include agreements to cede operational command to AFRICOM. Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, one of 2 main forward operating sites in Africa, has been expanded from 88 acres to about 600 acres since 2002. In 2006, only 1% of all U.S. commandos deployed overseas went to Africa. In 2016, over 17% of U.S. commandos deployed overseas were in Africa. The U.S. has been expanding the drone and cooperative security locations in Niger with Camp Agadez. The U.S. is investing over $100 million and is in the area where 4 Special Forces personnel were killed in 2017. Since the launch of AFRICOM in 2008, there has been a 1,900% increase in U.S. military presence on the African continent. 2017, U.S. troops are now conducting 3,500 exercises, programs, and engagements per year. An average of nearly 10 missions per day on the African continent, according to the Afrikan Commander General Thomas Waldhauser. Africa has witnessed the most dramatic growth in deployment of America's elite troops of any region of the globe over the past decade. This timeline and information about AFRICOM has been brought to you by Black Alliance for Peace. Check out their website and join their mailing list.
Great. Thanks, Netfa. We also want to thank Willie Chino, the director of the Peace Report, who was on the call. They produced the video. So yeah, I thought that that video was a great intro to AFRICOM. Yeah, all power to the people. Right on, Willie. We're really excited to get into the presenters. I spoke a little bit too soon, but I think that speaks to how excited I am to hear from everyone. So first off, we have Margaret Kimberley, who is a co-founder, editor, and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report. She's the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents, and a contributor to the anthology In Defense of Julian Assange. Her work as an activist includes leadership roles in the Black Alliance for Peace and the United National Anti-War Coalition. So welcome to Margaret.
Mark, you have to unmute. Margaret, you have to unmute yourself.
Let me message her. Let's see.
Yeah, she's unmuted now, I think. No, not yet.
She's still muted.
Margaret, you need to unmute. Sorry.
Are you able to unmute her?
I cannot unmute. I can only ask her to unmute herself.
Oh.
It's in the bottom left corner.
And someone call her on the phone, tell her what to do.
Well,
She's not a novice to this. She does, but try your view, the view that where you see your own picture. There's also a feature there that allows you to unmute. If you put your cursor on it.
I'm just a listener, but I heard Margaret say I can't unmute.
Yeah. Oh, oh, sorry. Do that again.
So Dick, why don't we, as she is working on that, why don't we move to the next presenter and bring her back?
Right. So the next presenter is Martin. He will be presenting in French. So you will all have to utilize the interpreter functionality in order to listen to in English. So if Martin is ready to go, I can introduce him. Martin Bunziga Azaboyi has a doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of the Congo. He's a member of the 4 Channel, member of Congo Love, and coordinator of the Telema Youth Movement, which is a great organization. His research field has been in the areas of political philosophy, social philosophy, philosophy of language, philosophy of law, and Pan-Africanism. So as well. So welcome to Martin, and I ask you all to
please mute yourself
in order to listen to him in English.
Hi, I just muted everybody again, so Martin will have to unmute. And just to give folks that need
Martin,
interpretation,
are you ready to go?
Just to give folks interpretation instructions, go ahead and click on the 3 dots. It should say interpretation, and then go ahead and click English. Remember to mute the original audio.
Bonsoir. Merci. Il se pose le problème de la langue. Alors, je suis Martin, à République démocratique du Congo. Je coordonne le mouvement de Telema depuis un certain temps.
Martin, s'il vous plaît.
Martin.
Il y a des deux things avec les audios qui sont un écho.
Je vous saisis mal.
Martin, en fait, ce que Geneviève dit, c'est qu'il y a de l'écho dans ce que vous dites. Si vous pouvez regarder votre audio.
Oui, je suis Martin Azaboyi de la RDC. Oui, je coordonne le mouvement Telema. Oui. Il s'agit de dire quelque chose au-delà de la présentation. Le mouvement évolue à son sein et nous sommes en train de lutter contre le système qui essaie de nous mettre la poitrine, au moins à partir des efforts fournis du mouvement. Ça nous permet le mouvement à soi peut-être aussi comme pas un catalyseur, mais un système qui a l'idéologie de chercher à mettre fin à la situation. Parce que à partir même de ces documents que nous voyons de regarder, ou bien les thèmes proposés pour la soirée d'aujourd'hui, l'impérialisme à soi à ronger notre système. C'est à partir de notre veille de la conscience, on essaie un peu d'aller au-delà de ce système. C'est aller au-delà de ce système, non seulement pour comprendre, mais aussi pour chercher à effectuer un saut métaphysique. Parce que le souci de Telema, c'est chercher à vivre le panafricanisme de peuple, à vivre le panafricanisme qui pense à tout le monde et non chercher à vivre dans l'égocentrisme. C'est une manière synthétique que je peux m'expliquer au sujet de Telema, un mouvement populaire qui essaie de réfléchir sur la réalité de la RDC en allant au-delà aussi des frontières de la RDC. Merci.
It seems that there is problems with the French to English interpretation. Did folks? Yeah, it seems that folks did what they had to do.
Yeah, well, at this time, we can go with Margaret. Margaret, if you're ready.
Yes, I am.
Oh, great. That's good news. We're excited to hear you speak about things. It looks like you've gone on mute one more time.
All right. Hello, everybody. So sorry about that. It was so embarrassing. My Zoom page just disappeared. You were all there, but I couldn't find it anyway. But I'm here now and ready to talk about East Africa.
Hello.
Yes, and AFRICOM in Somalia in particular. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for your patience. And today I wanted to talk about the history of US intervention in Eastern Africa. And it's a history which makes clear that the country is an empire, despite all denials to the contrary. The US is a hegemon which acts for the sole purpose of expanding its military power and destroying any ability of other nations to practice sovereignty and act on behalf of the needs of their people. Somalia is the Eastern African nation which has suffered the most from US aggressions. The base at Camp Lemonnier, which was just mentioned, was established in neighboring Djibouti in 2002, which is 5 years before the US Africa Command was established. Djibouti is bordered by Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And Camp Lemonnier sits directly across the Gulf of Aden from Yemen. And this location makes it the logical location for staging drone operations, which began there in 2006, also before AFRICOM was officially established. Most Americans don't know much about Somalia except for bad movies, US propaganda about it. And the only thing that if you ask people what they know, they would know the name Al-Shabaab, the resistance group. But in the lens of corporate media, they're nothing but terrorists. And our duopoly in this country also parrot these tropes. But it's important to hear from them, even from those forces who are labeled as terrorists. The biggest mass killers, lest we forget, are always governments. And the US is no exception to that. And in the process of committing their aggression, they create resentments, hatreds, and desire for revenge. And Al-Shabaab is a typical example of that process. People heard much about them in 2013 and 2015 when they attacked civilians at a shopping mall and at a university in Kenya. But I think it's important to hear their words about why they act as they do. Quote, in Somalia, the Kenyan military has committed a countless number of atrocities against the Muslim population. With their government's approval, the Kenyan military embarked on a series of mass killings, tortures, and systematic rape of Muslim women in Somalia. Tens of thousands of Muslims were displaced from their homes, hundreds more were killed, and thousands injured as a direct result of the Kenya invasion. Kenyan jets shelled refugee camps and hospitals, killing dozens more. They strafed entire villages from the air, killed livestock and bombarded madrasas and educational institutions, crushing with malice the dreams and hopes of an entire generation, unquote. Somalia is a nation that's long been torn apart by civil war, which was aided and abetted by the United States and by neighboring countries, Ethiopia and Kenya, working in league with the US. When Somalia began to emerge as a stable nation, the US and Ethiopia acted quickly to make sure that it remained weak and vulnerable. Ethiopia invaded Somalia at America's urging and was later joined by Kenya and other puppet African governments who remain in the country. No one wants to live in a nation occupied by foreign armies where there's starvation and death, and Somalis, of course, are no exception to this. The United States continues drone strikes which claim to kill a particular al-Shabaab leader, and in so doing, keep Somalia in a state of failure. No stone is left unturned in the effort to keep it from becoming a thriving nation with its sovereignty intact. It's important to remember that the goals of US imperialism are not just about controlling resources or putting friendly states in power. That's always true, but oftentimes the US creates chaos for its own sake, and in that instability gets to have its way across the world. And this has escalated under the Trump administration. In the first 4 months of this year, there were more airstrikes there in Somalia than in all of Barack Obama's term. There are 5 bases there with the fluctuating deployment of between 650 and 800 people. The current president, Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed, also known as Farmajo, was elected shortly after Trump. He's a dual Somali US national who's given the US a blank check to do whatever it likes. During this time, the number of strikes have spiked, and it also isn't clear if they're being carried out by AFRICOM or by the CIA. The administration doesn't even inform members of Congress about what it is carrying out and where. They acknowledge more than 200 strikes and estimate 900 to 1,000 deaths. But it's not in the interests of the United States to be honest about its activities, even in, or perhaps especially in dealing with members of Congress. The most famous Somali in this country is Representative Ilhan Omar. And she and her colleagues wrote a letter to the administration last month. And the letter begins, quote, "We welcome this step to provide increased transparency and public accounting of US military operations and as part of our national commitment to minimizing civilian casualties. This action is consistent with the demonstrated interest of Congress for greater transparency in our nation's use of targeted force and our efforts to prevent civilian casualties." But then they go on and they say, they speak of the discrepancies between those of NGOs and the administration and the number of civilians' deaths. But, and they add, "We recognize that in some cases, our adversaries may seek to provide misinformation about civilian casualties." So that makes clear where their interests are. Their interests are with the state. They go through the motions of expressing concern while giving the military and intelligence agencies freedom to reveal whatever they want and to hide whatever they want. Meanwhile, the people in that country suffer as the US decides who is or isn't a member of al-Shabaab and therefore a legitimate target. We can't allow the people who make war to be the arbiters of what is and isn't acceptable. Members of Congress, regardless of race or place of origin, are loyal to the state and continue to uphold US dictates. Notice that the letter from Omar and her colleagues doesn't question the aggression against Somalia at all, and instead begs for some crumb of information that presumably would satisfy them. That's why the Black Alliance for Peace campaign, no compromise, no retreat, defeat the war against Black African people in the US and abroad. That's why our campaign exists. And if you go to our website, you can see this and other campaigns and get information about our candidate pledge, which asks signatories to, among other things, reduce the military budget, end the 1033 program, which militarizes our country, and dismantle AFRICOM altogether. This is a presidential election year, and we're exhorted to think that there will be some great difference come November if there's a new administration. But let's not forget, the first military presence in Somalia took place in 1992 when Bill Clinton was president. George W. Bush established more bases and started AFRICOM. Obama built on AFRICOM with more deployments, and Trump has expanded air and drone strikes. We can't wait for Congress or presidents to change what they are obviously committed to continuing. Please join us in our campaigns by partnering with Black Alliance for Peace as we work to increase information and knowledge to the American people and to people all over the world so that we can fight these US aggressions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. Really appreciate those remarks. We're going to go to Martin. I believe the interpretation feature has been fixed. So Martin, we'd really like to hear your remarks.
Did anyone explain that to Martin? Interpret that what John Tunde just said to Martin?
Oui, telle que la situation se présente, de l'AFRICOM se présente à République démocratique du Congo, nous les sentons dans notre manière de comprendre et de réaliser la politique ici chez nous. Notre armée est infiltrée. La RDC a 26 provinces. Dans chaque province, il y a la présence de l'armée étrangère d'AFRICOM. Et cela fragilise la République démocratique du Congo. Dans ces 26 provinces, avec la capitale, il nous est difficile de les comprendre. Mais nous comprenons bien que l'objectif de l'AFRICOM n'est pas de mettre la sécurité en Afrique, mais plutôt de piller les ressources de l'Afrique, en particulier de la RDC. La RDC a ses richesses à l'Est. Et vous allez retrouver ces bases à l'Est, et les pays limitrophes de la RDC favorisent cette mission. Ils pillent le coltan, ils pillent l'uranium, ils pillent l'or, ils pillent les diamants, ils pillent d'autres matières premières. Telema a une mission par rapport à cette situation. L'objectif principal que Telema a activé dans sa façon de faire, c'est d'enseigner à la population les réalités normales et l'histoire vraie de la RDC. D'où viennent les guerres de la RDC, qui orchestre les guerres de la RDC, qui chapeaute les guerres de la RDC. D'où, dans notre manière d'opérer, nous avons une manière de travailler par module. On enseigne le peuple par module. Et nous avons 4 modules qu'on utilise souvent. On commence par saisir les enjeux de la guerre au Congo. La RDC à soi est toujours et déjà dans les guerres. Si la guerre n'est pas à l'est, à l'ouest, il y a la guerre. Si la guerre n'est pas au nord, au sud, il y a la guerre. Et tout ce qui orchestre ces guerres-là, ce sont les multinationaux, ce sont les capitalistes avec leurs bases militaires. De deux, nous enseignons une manière idoine de défier cette réalité, c'est refonder l'État social et l'État national. Telema s'occupe de ça. Le peuple congolais, si on dit qu'il est en train de souffrir aujourd'hui, c'est à cause de ses bases militaires. Quand ils infiltrent même notre façon de travailler, de l'Afrique en général et en particulier de la RDC, c'est fragiliser nos militaires autochtones pour qu'ils puissent les contrôler. Et cela est dramatique. Parce qu'il y a un adage qui dit « la main qui donne, c'est la main qui dirige ». Alors, la troisième position de Telema pour bien défier cette réalité, c'est enseigner à la population congolaise le thème intitulé « Gagner la guerre des idées ». Pourquoi? Parce qu'on s'est dit la guerre dont les Congolais souffrent n'est plus à soi une guerre physique. La guerre est idéologique. Et si quelqu'un qui est basé, qui baigne dans les idées, si tu les combats physiquement, tu ne peux pas les gagner. C'est dans ce sens, nous essayons d'établir les principes idéologico-sociaux pour combattre ces systèmes qui ne permettent pas un beau décollage de la RDC. Parce que, dit-on, si la RDC décolle économiquement, l'Afrique va de l'avant. Et le quatrième point que Telema met en musique, c'est réaliser le panafricanisme de peuple. On sait toujours dire, la RDC est au cœur de l'Afrique. Si la RDC va bien, l'Afrique en général ira mieux. Ainsi, ces gens que nous les appelons les capitalistes, par leur mission d'AFRICOM, installent les bases chez nos voisins, d'abord pour extraire les minéraux tels que je l'ai dit, mais aussi pour fragiliser nos frontières. Et quand ils fragilisent les frontières, le peuple ne sait pas s'y prendre et tout tombe par terre, les minéraux partent, le peuple est tué et le pays est paralysé. Et notre souci, c'est d'enseigner à la population le panafricanisme du peuple. Le panafricanisme des peuples a l'impact positif, non seulement sur la vie individuelle, mais surtout sur la vie nationale et internationale. Si le peuple d'une province comprend ce qui se passe dans l'autre province, le panafricanisme du peuple permettra de tisser l'unité et l'unité nationale que prônait Lumumba, l'unité que prônait Sankara, l'unité que prônait d'autres Africains. Et je m'en souviens, et c'est là aussi on enseigne à la population congolaise l'adage prononcé par Aziz Fall. Il l'a toujours répété: quand le peuple se soulève, l'impérialisme tremble. Et cette phrase nous aide comme une arme lourde pour essayer de conscientiser le peuple congolais pour que le pays aille de l'avant. Franchement parlant, la RDC est fragilisée. Pourquoi? Parce qu'elle est grande. La RDC compte 26 provinces plus la ville de Kinshasa. Et toutes ces provinces constituent en réalité les pays. Pourquoi? Parce qu'un pays comme la Belgique entre 80 fois dans RDC. Imaginez la grandeur de la chose. C'est ainsi que Telema a un travail à faire. Telema a quelque chose qui doit transmettre à la société congolaise. Et ce défi est non seulement pour la RDC, mais aussi pour l'Afrique. Parce qu'avec l'eau de la RDC, l'Afrique peut être alimentée. Avec les richesses de la RDC, l'Afrique peut être alimentée. Voilà la notion du panafricanisme de peuple. Les guerres de la RDC sont orchestrées par les capitalistes. Et ces capitalistes savent qu'ils ne viennent pas mettre la paix en Afrique. Si Bush avait mis au pied l'histoire d'AFRICOM, parce qu'il y avait quelques Américains qui étaient tués en Nairobi. Et rappelez-vous de la situation de 1998 et de 2001, il y a eu l'opération de terrorisme et lui a pensé qu'une bonne manière de calmer la situation, il faut orchestrer cette chambrette de la réalité pour réprimander et brimer l'Afrique. Les dires, la façon dont il expliquait les plans, c'était pour essayer de mettre l'harmonie. Eh bien, c'est très faux. C'est pour piller et repiller l'Afrique. Je le dis et je le répète, l'Afrique n'est pas pauvre. La RDC n'est pas pauvre. Il le faut, ils affaiblissent l'Afrique, ils affaiblissent la RDC. Eh bien, on combat les stratèges par les stratégies. Les 4 piliers stratégiques que nous avons mis, je l'ai déjà répété, c'est saisir les enjeux de la guerre. C'est refonder l'État national dans le principe panafricain. C'est gagner la guerre des idées. Parce que la guerre n'est plus physique. La guerre est idéologique et propager le panafricanisme du peuple. Voilà comment Telema est défié et les combats que nous sommes en train de mener au centre de l'Afrique, parce que l'Afrique attend de la RDC la libération, non seulement économique, mais aussi du progrès. Merci, je dis et je vous en remercie.
Thank you, Martin. Martin does great work with the Telema youth movement, as he said. They are very focused on supporting, developing, and sustaining an organized popular movement in the Congo for peace, justice, and human dignity. And they're working with the diaspora as well. So we really appreciate that work. Next up, we have Elias Amare. He is an investigative journalist and researcher from Eritrea, the only African with no military-to-military relationship with the U.S. Elias is also a founding member and senior fellow of the Asmara-based Peacebuilding Center for the Horn of Africa, and he has been an active member of the EPLF, or the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, since the 1970s. So welcome, Elias.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you. Well, greetings to the organizers of this webinar on AFRICOM, the Black Alliance for Peace, all the comrades that are doing the good work, brothers and sisters. I bring to you greetings and salutations from Eritrea, a country that was born in struggle, resisting imperialist hegemony in the part of Africa that's called Horn of Africa. That's the eastern part of Africa. And as Margaret Kimberley earlier alluded, that part of Africa, the Horn of Africa, where Somalia is, Ethiopia, Djibouti, the largest US base, Camp Lemonnier, is, I think, without exaggeration, the most volatile and most militarily intervened by foreign great powers in Africa. That would not be an exaggeration to claim that. And the history of my country is a history born in resistance to this imperialist domination. In particular, it has also a very close connection with military bases. The reason Eritrea was annexed to Ethiopia in the first place in the 1940s, and I will take you back in history, please bear with me, because history matters. If you don't understand the historical context, you will not understand why Eritrea is opposed to AFRICOM. And so I have to go back to the 1940s. It's worth mentioning that Eritrea was a colony of Italy. Italy in the Second World War. In the Second World War, Italy aligned itself, Italy under Mussolini, fascist Italy, aligned itself with Hitler. And thus, for the British and the Allied forces, it was important that they secure the Red Sea because the British had control of Egypt. And Haile Selassie, of course, had fled, the king of Ethiopia had fled to Europe because his country, Ethiopia, was invaded by fascist Mussolini. So in 1941, then, the British helped to restore the king of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, to his throne. And they of course, occupy Eritrea for 10 years, military administration. It was not a direct colonial rule, but sort of temporary military administration. And so the US enters the scene at around this time, but they had some kind of a small base, Air Force base in Eritrea to help the war effort in Second World War. When the war ends, the Second World War, that is, when it ends in 1945, you may remember something called the Yalta Conference, the victors, President Roosevelt of the United States, Stalin of the Soviet Union, USSR, and Churchill of UK, Great Britain. They meet at a place called Yalta. After that, they having discussed, they needed to discuss about the post-war administration of Europe and what have you. Roosevelt then travels on a ship to Egypt. There he summons 3 leaders. The leader of Saudi Arabia at that time, King Abdullahi, the leader of Ethiopia, King Haile Selassie, Emperor Haile Selassie, and the leader of Egypt, King Pharaoh. These were to be important allies of the United States. So both the 3 of them in turn come and have a talk with him about the future and US strategic interests in the area. Of course, for the United States then, it was important to secure a base in the Red Sea. And therefore, as a quid pro quo with Emperor Haile Selassie, they enter into an agreement whereby the US would help Haile Selassie to have an access to the sea through annexation of Eritrea. And in turn, Ethiopia would grant the United States military base in Eritrea, because that part is very strategic to control for the United States. You remember the Cold War is emerging at this time with the Soviet Union. The Red Sea is a very vital sea route for oil. Oil is going to be very important for Europe, and it passes through that corridor, the Red Sea. So whoever controls the Red Sea has a strategic supremacy. So from the geopolitical, geostrategic perspective, it was very important for the United States to occupy, to have a military base in that part of the world, in Eritrea. And therefore, the right of self-determination of the Eritrean people was sacrificed at the altar of US strategic interests. The United States, of course, supports Ethiopia to annex Eritrea. There is a famous quote by the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who says in 1950, when the issue of what will happen to Eritrea, the future of Eritrea comes in the United Nations debate, the General Assembly, he says, from the point of view of justice, the opinion of the Eritrean people for self-determination has to receive is not worthy. Nevertheless, the strategic interests of the United States in the Red Sea Basin and the interests of world security and that of our ally Ethiopia for access to the sea make it necessary that the country, Eritrea, has to be somehow linked or annexed to Ethiopia. A very clear statement. And so as a quid pro quo then, military base was granted for the United States in Eritrea, in the capital, Asmara. This military base was called Kanyo. It was the largest in Africa at that time, close to 5,000 personnel. Mostly it was a communication base, but later in the 1960s, it becomes very, very important also with the war in Vietnam heating up, it becomes important for the United States. R&R for those wounded soldiers to come and recuperate officers, what have you, of course, to monitor all communications of the Soviet and its allies in that area, and also to control the Red Sea. And so, when the Eritrean people took up arms to restore their right of self-determination in 1961, this military base was a heavy presence there. And the quid pro quo in this for Ethiopia, of course, the United States pumped in huge amounts of funds to support the army of Ethiopia. It built with the Ethiopian armies, the Ethiopian Navy, the Ethiopian Air Force, and somehow it also, whether directly or indirectly, supported the war in Ethiopia, the war that Ethiopia was conducting against Eritrean freedom fighters. And the United States ally Israel also entered the scene. It trained counterinsurgency commandos against the Eritrean freedom fighters. So basically up to the demise of Emperor Haile Selassie, which was 1974, there was a heavy US military presence in my country, in Eritrea. So we suffered from this. We know what military bases mean, what imperialism, the ugly face of imperialism and its aggression. It had cost us hugely in terms of human lives and destruction of our country. It took us 30 years to recover our independence in 1991. But by 1974, the war in Eritrea had entered almost its 15th year. It was costing human lives. The Ethiopian military was suffering defeat. And as a result of that, the Ethiopian army in Eritrea mutinied against Emperor Haile Selassie, and Haile Selassie was overthrown. And thus, the Kanyo station, the American military base, was terminated. Its lease, its contract was to expire in 1977. And it moved to Diego Garcia, a small island, British controlled island in the Indian Ocean. But if you examine the records at that time in the State Department, the discussions that were being conducted, say, by people like Henry Kissinger or the National Security Advisor to President Gerald Ford at that time, Brent Scowcroft. These people were extremely worried. They didn't want to lose that Kanyo base in Eritrea. It was not
Elias, you
yes,
have 2 minutes left, sorry.
2 minutes, I will wrap up. Anyway, the Soviets entered the scene and the same thing happens. The Soviets also had a base in Dahlak Island when they supported Ethiopia. To shorten my brief talk then, why Eritrea opposes military basing is because its history clearly shows that it was a victim of such kind of foreign military bases, of such kind of great power intervention, the superpower rivalry. Now, let's fast forward to the present. The Soviet Union collapsed. The UN is a single, superpower, or we have entered a unipolar world. Of course, there is now rivalry with China. There is what is called the pivot to Asia in strategic terms. So Africa becomes important and for the United States and the Western Empire. Because Africa is not poor. Africa is rich in resources. So whoever controls these resources of Africa would have strategic interests. We have now entered a period called the New Scramble of Africa. And thus this AFRICOM, this military occupation of Africa, is a continuation of that new scramble for Africa. The old scramble for Africa ushered in colonialism to Africa. This new scramble of Africa is a continuation of colonialism, what we call neo-colonialism, and thus AFRICOM has to be opposed. And I support, the stand of Black Alliance for Peace to oppose this. It will not bring any stability. It will increase instability in Africa, more wars, as we have witnessed in the past. Since AFRICOM was established in 2008, up to now, 12 years, more wars, more conflicts is what we are witnessing in Africa, not stability, not economic development. My country is, of course, the only African country now that doesn't have any relationship with Africa or military-to-military cooperation with US military, but you know, the bases in Africa are not only physical bases. What makes it more dangerous is that it's the African armies that are occupied. The military to military cooperation is what makes it dangerous. The US doesn't need much by way of physical bases, because for one, they're expensive. For two, they're too visible. African people will not stand for it. But this military to military cooperation is that the generals of the African militaries, the colonels, the majors, all are under the control. They're trained by US military.
Thank you,
Elias. So
yeah,
I'm sorry I've made it long, but thank you. If there are any more issues, I will leave it to the discussion period. Thank you again.
Great. We really appreciate your talk, Elias. And like you said, there's a Q&A after all of the presenters have spoken. I just want to remind everyone about patience and technology and colonized languages. You know, racism is a function of colonialism, and we have to utilize these colonial languages with which to communicate to a broader audience. So we appreciate everyone's patience with that. And then I want to introduce the next presenter. Their name is Aziz Fall, his name. He's an international political scientist of Senegalese and Egyptian origin. He's the former coordinator of the Quebec Network Against Apartheid. He's also founder and member of GRILA, the research and initiative group for the liberation of Africa. He also teaches political science, anthropology, international relations, and international development at McGill University and UQAM. So welcome to Aziz.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, we do.
Thank you, good afternoon. Thank you, all of you, for the great opportunity to participate in this event on Soweto Day. This is a special day for us. I'm extending you greetings from the members of the Research and Initiative Group for the Liberation of Africa, GRILA, which is turning 36 years old now. Our group was the first on the continent to stand in the way of the expansionist aim of the post-apartheid era, notably with Warren Christopher's African Crisis Response Force, and to propose our Pan-African option, which was called at the time Africa Pax. GRILA is also one of the first group that denounced AFRICOM in 2009, and later by launching on May 25th, 2013, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the so-called African independence, a declaration co-signed by 50 prominent African and German personality, entitled AFRICOM Go Home, Neither in Africa nor in Germany. I may paste it for the viewers if you allow me to share this link, as obviously many of people participating were not aware of that. It has been actually very difficult for us over the years to convince our American brothers and sisters on the relevance of our struggle, for all sorts of reasons, among others, of course, the American propaganda about its role as protector of the world, the constant propaganda depicting our advocacy as conspiracy analysis, the cooptation of American civilians and military in the rhetoric of America's patriotic defense, not to mention the increasing destabilization of terrorism in Africa. But our greatest weakness has been to explain the complex dynamics of our oppression to our African masses, who are caught up in the management of daily life and the problem of underdevelopment, and who often perceive these issues as too complex, long-term, or without any capacity to control them. To this must be added the powerlessness of our elite, often dependent of outside financially, technological, and military support, and the weakness of Pan-African unity, This allowed me, alas, in a hurry and without means, to dedicate a film to illustrate our advocacy work. It is available on YouTube. I will also paste it here for the participants in case you haven't seen it. There's a German version, an English version, and a French version. The film is called AFRICOM Go Home. It has a Pan-Africanist analysis, and it treats all the non-African countries with bases in Africa or instrumentalizing our regimes in the same way, i.e. Occupying forces. We actually almost succeeded in convincing some of the German population that the base violates its own constitution, but the terrorist attack in Berlin jeopardized our peace effort. And Germany became then more proactive, having now a more aggressive role in the continent. This is explained actually in the film with great detail. Certainly there is a greater emphasis on the American force, but illustrations have been made also on interventionism, intelligence, nuisance of the French intervention and military intervention. It's good to compare these two countries. The two allies are hardly comparable. The US defense budget exceeds the combined budget of the 7 countries that follow it, like the alpha male, you know, in the Wolf Pack, and this allied pack of the United States account for 75% of the world's military spending. So the extension of the American system and the co-optation of our military regime is more significant after this film. However, we should not underestimate the French presence, but also new players. And these are linked to the way secret defense agreement conditional on neo-colonial independence and the militaristic connivance of business network. New players like Turkey or Russia need also more scrutiny in our analysis. As I predicted it in the film AFRICOM Go Home, an independent study from the University of Maryland, National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism, illustrate the dramatic increase in transnational attacks since the establishment of AFRICOM. So today, as Libya is totally in a war-torn situation, we have to remember that it was in March 19, 2011, that AFRICOM launched the operation called Odyssey Down. That was the first phase of the war to overthrow the government in Tripoli, which was finally completed by France. It's an amazing, interesting plot to analyze, really in a cynical way. And the sinister result is the dislocation of Libya, the activism of France, Russia, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirate, jihadist force, Syrian mercenaries, Libyan tribes, Sudanese, Chadian ethnic militia group, and all kind of trafficking. And this actually introduced a destabilization of the model of Sahelistan that extends to Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and dislocate the sub-region as far as Mozambique. As it is shown in the film, and unfortunately we don't really have time to show the real progression of how the AFRICOM web have slowly placed our African army, our national army, under the control of NATO forces and AFRICOM. And the constant prospect of seeing the AFRICOM base move to Africa is actually a decentralized process. And this allows other recent military bases like Japan, China in Djibouti, Germany in Niger, Turkey and Israel having protective support. All of this actually is jeopardizing any real African integration. So as two of my fellow participants have said, the prospect the prospect of an AFRICOM base in Africa, which is still rejected by most countries on the continent, is attractive for a few. It has become a fait accompli as the strategy of indoctrination, encirclement and diffusion in the continent, as also it creates hotbeds of tension that are maintained. So here, AFRICOM, NATO arrangement and unilateral initiatives by some NATO countries like France benefit exclusively to the interests of the countries of the core and their local compatriot, and some surrogate elites from our countries. But we have actually new players entering the race. As my comrade from Eritrea explained, the scramble is also the fact that the sole purpose of these bases is to secure in the long term and for their own purpose our raw material, our strategic space in the face of appetite of powerful emerging countries like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, or China. But also our own prospect of unity is a threat to their interest. Actually, none of these NATO countries need a large military base in Africa. Not only that they have several bases and facilities, but they go wherever they want on the continent because of bilateral clauses and other related arrangements. Most armies of African countries have been co-opted by the force of imperialism and also their private militias and other security companies. So there's like a blackmail of instability that threatened many countries, to name a few: Sudan, Egypt, Nigeria, Tunisia, the Central Republic of Africa, Algeria, and so on. And they have to align. If you don't align to this strategy, it's very hard, you know, to obtain even the debt cancellation and so on. So what happened is that at least 36 countries of the continent have sent to Washington to train the next so-called generation of security sector leaders. This is in the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. And these are high-ranking officers which are part of a system of operational and military capacity building under AFRICOM Theater Security Cooperation Program. So not to name the very important maneuvers, you know, Flint Talk, Kutlex Express, Africa Endeavors, etc., where they are slowly co-opted. So we need to show exactly what is happening. It's like a syndrome where you create conflict, and more of the terrorist nature of political adventurers exist. I'm not saying that terrorism doesn't have its own agenda, but in fact, it's a Pandora box that was actually started by these very warmongers. And this is clearly also shown in the film under the so-called neocons strategy. So today we have an instrumentalization of disorder and using juniors corporation. The juniors are small multinational firms, and among them, some are causing up to the nebula of the so-called rebellion or terrorist for access to resources. And the link with foreign forces, which come to liberate us in the disputed area, are part of the strategy of the whole security system, validating militarization. The second is that they have lost the economic battle in front of China and other players. So the only way to prevail, in fact, is the geopolitics. So both AFRICOM and NATO are crisscrossing the continent, sophisticated in a policy that goes back a long way.
Hi, Aziz, you have 2 minutes left. And
it's important to understand that the way we portray the role of China as actually a scapegoat of the social imperialism need also to be analyzed. But the war on terror has done everything but get rid of terrorism. The alliances and the tactics that are used by friends serve its own interest. The world capitalist system creates an aspiration that it cannot satisfy for the multitude. Of course, many are attracted by the beam of light, like the flabbergasted butterflies, but the consciousness strata of our youth remains, and it is not so fooled. But as this capitalist system is senile, and as we are facing a crisis in its ecological viability, we know that the security issue become a conditionality for aid, for economic adjustment, and so on. So basically, to wrap up with this, we are facing a position where a panoptic drone war against with middle powers that are used in order to undermine any national or Pan-African unity is raging. So it is up to Africa to defend its sovereignty and to take advantage of the diversified South-South perspective of cooperation and solidarity. And these military powers competing on our soil are not omnipotent. They are riddled with contradiction. They could not abuse their advantage so much if Africa is united. That is why our comprador regime need to be overthrown. This is why we have to resist against this tide and inform a little more the population to repoliticize the youth. And this allows us to continue to act and talk about this issue wherever we can and defend our continent with the last energy. We have defeated apartheid and we will continue to fight for the sovereignty of the entire continent so that its children and diaspora can once again flourish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziz. Great talk. I definitely agree. We need to educate or inform our peers about the workings of AFRICOM. Next up, we have Dr. Affiong Affiong, who is a dynamic speaker and organizer from Nigeria. She's the co-founder of the Moyo wa Taifa, a Pan-African women's network created to establish links between African women on the continent and in the diaspora. She's also the executive director of the Moyo Pan-African Solidarity Center, based in Accra and London. The center promotes awareness and knowledge on the legacy of Africa's contribution to world history and human development. So welcome to Dr. Affiong.
Hi, greetings. Can you all hear me? I'm not sure if you can see me, but can you hear me?
We can hear you. The sound is a little choppy, but we can hear you. So you can.
Okay. Okay then. I mean, I'm not. First of all, I'd like to bring greetings from Moyo wa Taifa to the, you know, the alliance. It's powerful, you know. To a different level, another level. I think it's very crucial to have a continental and, you know, a diaspora-based global alliance, you know, on specific things like Africa, like the defeat of neocolonialism and, you know, our struggle against imperialism, which for us in Moyo wa Taifa, you know, we think that this, it's the mission continent here. And of course, you know, for Africans in America, for example, the Africans in America, you know, face the same thing. You know, they are trapped, you know, in a colony in the Western Hemisphere. So I think that, you know, we need to work, you know, like that together. I'd like to touch on, I hear something about my sound quality not being that good. Oh dear. I'm not sure what I could do to help there.
No worries. I would just.
Did you mean for your camera to be off too?
Yes. It's probably the internet.
But it's fine. Let's go. It's fine.
It was fine before. Internet is probably going in and out, and you know. So okay. Well, I've just brought it down now, so I'll hold it close to me. Oh, let me just, you know, by giving, you know, sharing some information. And I think that we're going to need to have probably more working meetings, not necessarily public ones like this with the alliance in terms of, but, you know, the AFRICOM was actually and you know, actually it was operational on the continent, and a lot of people don't know that. You know, he conceptualized, you know, the African High Command, and they also called it AFRICOM. And AFRICOM actually operated on the continent for, I think, 3 or 4 years. You know, I think it was Algeria, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, and Egypt, and there was another country. I'm going to go back and dig that information up, you know, to share it, because so that we actually have an understanding of the history of AFRICOM. Now, clearly,
the AFRICOM that was created, by Nkrumah was an African high command by Africans, for Africans, with Africans, to fight as one, unit against external aggression and to secure, the continent. So what has happened is that, the Americans, because of the issue of a vacuum in Africa, a vacuum in the sense of, no African unity, hijacked the concept and thought, well, since you can't do it for yourself, we'll do it for you, and that's how they started their own AFRICOM, which is an African high command by the Americans. Now, apparently, there's also an Asian high command, and they have this, because I do work in the archives, they have they had all of these things for different parts of the world. Now, I don't know how active the other ones, because it's a question of resources. So I wanted to put that on the table so that those of us who do work around this, have clarity on it, and have clarity that, Nkrumah, anybody that knows Nkrumah knows he was extremely hostile, to external interference, in the issues of Africa. So his AFRICOM, was, an African initiative, by Africans, for Africans, with Africans, against, external aggression and interference. And like I said, it was actually active for a few years. Now, this formed by the imperialists, have neo-colonialist African leaders act. Of course, earlier at the beginning, and yes, they did instinctively. They want, to each leader and say, look, this is the deal. We'll do A, B, C, D for you. And we're actually, coming to help you. So this is the narrative, that they now sell, to citizens about, AFRICOM actually being of benefit, to
So we're not hearing you, Dr.
Public are very pro-Africa, and this so our banks, imperialism. But hi, I'm back.
Yeah, we can hear you now. But it's going in and out.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? It's just the internet. Can you hear me? I can see the speaker. Sorry, the facilitator. But can you all hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Yeah, no worries. We can definitely hear you.
Chat, tell me if you can hear me. Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
So, okay. So, in Sirleaf of Liberia was, well, for obvious reasons, of Liberia's relationship to the US, was the one leader that openly welcomed AFRICOM. Now, initially, but because they were afraid of the backlash, from citizens. For example, in Nigeria, and this was way before AFRICOM, when the British, in the 60s, I think, or earlier, when the British tried to establish a military base here, the students' union movement rose up, as a very ferocious force and threatened the government that they would cause chaos if the British were allowed, to have a base. So the government had to back down. And I think even the president at that time, Musa Yar'Adua, if I'm not wrong, actually, when he went to Washington, he actually agreed to host AFRICOM. And by the time he came back, he had to send a message, to the Americans to say, oh, no, we're not having AFRICOM. Now, I make this point to say this, that our ability, certainly on the continent, to shut down AFRICOM is going to have to come from the masses, from the people, because what the government have now done is to just fade away the issue as if, there are no military bases, so they have a lot of interactions, with AFRICOM, without people knowing. So it's not a popular issue. It's not well known in terms of, the population. And of course, if you're in a country where, people, be thinking too much about whether or not there are military bases, having a military bases on way of spreading the message. But the point I'm making is that there's a direct connection between the neo-colonial leaders that we have on the continent, and so our work is cut out for us in the sense of challenging and exposing these neo-colonial forces as sellouts and people who would mortgage our silver, not even 30, like I don't know how many Judas had, if it was 3 or 30. Now I want to go now to some practical aspects. I think that this initiation, this initiative rather, between the alliance, reaching out to different groups on the continent and in the diaspora is extremely critical, especially at this time, because we're going to need that kind of continental and diaspora unity, and it's unity in action, unity in practice, where our people see, that people from all over the world, Africans, joining hands from across, the Atlantic and all over, are able to actually succeed, on a major task, a major project, like this, because at the end of the day, the ultimate question for us is not just about shutting down AFRICOM, it's about, defeating neo-colonialism. And so if we're able to, start with a concrete project, like this, then that would be really powerful for us, in terms of also, pushing forward the question of global African unity. Now, the other thing for people who live on the continent is that there are serious security implications, for being involved in an anti-African project. We live in the backyard of the beast, as it were. In its toilet, and neocolonialism is vicious, in the sense that imperialism is able to pretend, that it's democratic and it has some, semblance of human rights. Neocolonial regimes, have no time for such pretenses. And so when they see that this kind of project is, becoming successful or popular, there will be an attack on those, who are living on the continent. So we have to put all this issues, into our strategy, as we work, on this global campaign. And so, for me, the question really is, our modus operandi of collaborating on this, as an example, a powerful example of our power as global Africans, of our understanding, that we should, we attack the enemy, because the enemy is like an octopus. You know, it's got a multitude of hands and legs everywhere. And so we also organize like an octopus, you know, we're all over the world, but it's one, you know, body. And so I'm you know, really excited about how we're able to move forward and raise this as a popular issue, you know, and make the connections with our people, you know, that our sovereignty, you know, well, I must excuse myself by suggesting we're sovereign. You know, we're sovereign on paper, you know, but to say that, you know, where this is a continuation of the slave trade, you know, as it were, that, you know, we're still being controlled from, you know, from abroad. And like I said, for us in Moyo or Taifa, this is one of the things, you know, that confirms to us, you know, that, and this question that Fanon posed, you know, that what is the mission of, you know, each generation? And so this is you know, something we've got to answer. And, you know, this is the kind of work, you know, that we need to be focusing on in this 21st century. So I'm saying all this to say that it is a powerful initiative. You know, if we're able to make it happen, that would be extremely powerful, you know, of showing our power in organizing, in politics, and ultimately the question of African unity in our lifetime. You know, that's what this is about. So I'd like to end here. I don't know if I have any more time, but of course, you know, I'll take questions in the interactive session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Affiong. That was great. I am very inspired by your words. And I think Ajamu wanted to speak before I made the final remarks, and then we go into the Q&A.
Very briefly, before we go into this, to the critical period of questions and answers, just wanted to share with people, I put a link in the chat box. I put a link in the chat box. We are asking people, we want people to understand that, you know, while we may be at the center of empire here in the West, we are some poor Africans. We don't have any money, and we don't get any support from the enemy foundations. We come to people, and we have no problem coming to the people hat in hand because we serve the people. So we asking people during this webinar, and those folks who are listening on the Facebook, to go to the link, go to the blackallianceforpeace.com and to donate. If you like this program and you know we are doing serious work, we need some resources. Freedom ain't free. And I think we have made it quite clear that we are in this for the long haul. So take a moment. We want to raise $1,000 by the time we finish. Go to the site and give what you can. Uhuru. Thank you, Tunde.
Thank you, Ajamu. Absolutely. Click on the link in the chat bar and donate. I wanted to quickly call out that, you know, to act in the best interests of Black people and all of humanity means calling for the complete withdrawal of US forces and all foreign forces from Africa, and for the demilitarization of the African continent and the world. I agree completely with Dr. Affiong that a mass movement of people has to be forged in order to expose AFRICOM, expose neocolonialism, expose imperialism, and make the purpose clear and make it inseparable from what we're seeing today, the movement to resist the militarized police repression of people in the United States. So we ask that you please join us in our campaign to help build that movement and shut down AFRICOM by joining the US Out of Africa Network. And you can go to blackallianceforpeace.com/join US Out of Africa Network to do that. So that link is blackallianceforpeace.com/join US Out of Africa Network. But yeah, I'm very inspired by what I heard today. I wish I could have listened to y'all for longer, but we will have a Q&A section. So I encourage you to put your questions in the chat, or even just, just put your questions in the chat so we can hear more from our speakers. I personally got a lot out of that last speaker, Dr. Affiong. I really think your words were very inspiring. I actually was not aware that Nkrumah planned or did have, in fact, the U.S. High Command that was co-opted by the imperialists, by the United States, and it was at first intended to fight off imperialism, and yet now it is a tool of neocolonialism. So we're that's a very key, and absolutely we're definitely to establish relationships, build this worldwide movement, like you said, amongst the diaspora to fight against AFRICOM, but also against neocolonialism, like you said, Dr. Affiong. So we're looking forward to working with you and the speakers. Your talks were also very, very timely. If anyone has any questions, please do post them in the chat. I'm looking forward to hearing more from our speakers. All right, so is that a question? So it looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat now. The first one that I'm seeing is, does the United States have any economic development programs in place in Africa to run in parallel or to compete with China's Belt Road Initiative? So does anyone want to take that question? So from understanding, or if anyone else wants to take it, the United States has a very different approach than China in terms of its work on the continent. Obviously, they're trying to establish economic ties and military ties, but the United States is very much focused on the militarism. And so that has brought about a lot of, I guess, ancillary programs. We've seen them tout their investment in health aid, which pales in comparison to the drone bombing and the military bases and the military training. But I don't think that they have anything in terms of a China Belt Road Initiative. But Margaret, did you want to speak to that question in particular?
I don't think I can very well, to be honest, but I think you answered it pretty well yourself. The U.S. is after control, just a brute force controlling the military, which means controlling very many other things. It means controlling resources, controlling politics, making sure that friendly people stay in power. Excuse me. I know China's presence in Africa is problematic. It's difficult to say there are positives and negatives, but China does at the very least offer some support, some improvements in infrastructure and so forth. Of course, you have to talk about the experiences of African people in China as well, but it's kind of complicated, and I'm going to admit that I don't feel qualified to talk about it in more depth other than what I've just said.
Thank you, Margaret. Appreciate that answer. We'll move on to the question, how do we force the African Union and its leaders to embrace the movement to shut down AFRICOM? Aziz, did you want to take that question?
Well, truly, this is a very sensitive issue. As I have showed it in that film, there's a whole section on what happened in the African Union standby force. You know, it's a blackmail. This African Union is mainly funded by donors, not even by African countries. They can't even fund more than 1/3 of the budget. So there's like a blackmail going on. As I explained, we have to look the institution are almost a trade unions of head of states defending their stronghold. They are not passive. They are just in a position where they don't have the political means to enforce their own policies. They have been surrounded by the AFRICOM agenda, and this to link to the previous question, with the obvious, like all the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, have been instrumentalized by the United States, so they don't need exactly to do more on the economic level. So it's become a geopolitical support. And at this stage where we are, as Affiong have said, the issue of sovereignty, the issue of relinquishing some of our national domain to that institution is at stake. And we don't see a willingness to go towards that end. The NEPAD plan, as a play of word, NEPADs, was really something that was just aligned to the NATO and OECD guidelines. And the rest was basically the so-called plan on 2063, which is again an integration plan into the world economy. So we need a self-reliant plan with an internal market of self-consumption, which is not actually on the agenda. We need one solid defense army as the continental stage. There are some cosmetic measures, some are important, like the African passport and so on, but in fact, truly, we can see that they don't have the means to even address these issues, as they have been hijacked in their own process. As I said, the whole military staff has been actually co-opted into the American facilities and the other NATO facilities. So it's actually deeper than we can think. And as Affiong was also saying, it takes a popular movement, and before that, people have to be aware of the scope of what's going on. And this is not what is happening at this stage, unfortunately.
Thank you, Aziz. We actually have a question for Dr. Affiong. Dr. Affiong, could you speak to what kinds of concrete things we can do outside of Africa in order to deal with AFRICOM? What would you like to see from those in the diaspora?
Mute myself. Okay, hi, can you hear me now? Oh, there's so many things.
I can hear you.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, for people in the diaspora, I think first of all, to connect with the groups in the diaspora that are working on this issue, like the Black Alliance, because the Alliance has been doing this work for some time. It's not a fly-by-night thing. And because they would then have, the links, with, people on the continent who are also doing similar work. So we need to work in a structured manner, not in an individual one-on-one, manner. AFRICOM is also a security issue. So our neo-colonialists, because they think they are feeding off, the dregs, from the table of the imperialists, would see that as an attack on their, on the crumbs that they're getting. So I'm just saying, our struggle needs to be concrete. Now, also for those, working on the issue on the continent, one of the things is always the question of resources. Resources are always, an issue in terms of, the ability to do work. So for me, I always say that the question of resources is itself a political question. That's number two. So, to support with resources, but, for us to be structured. And thirdly, to amplify our voices, in the diaspora, to amplify the work, the voices, the realities, that people face. Because that's the thing, if we're making things real, like what happened to George Floyd, white supremacists have been hanging and lynching us, for years and years and years. What sparked this was actually seeing it. Okay, the point I'm making is that You know, we've got to bring this thing to make it real, you know, to people all over the world. If we're able to do that, you know, especially people in the diaspora are able to do that, that will help the struggle so much. You know, and the other thing is the security of activists who are working on this type of issues. Because, you know, one day you hear, you know, you spoke to somebody on Wednesday and by Friday they've disappeared. So then the question is, you know, to make it an issue, you know, to make it a burning issue. Where is so and so? You know, we want so and so, you know, and stuff. So just to have those things at the back of our minds, you know, and to be able to sustain them. Now, to be able to do all these things, it's not going to come from individual efforts. It's going to come from organized efforts. So people who want to help, you know, this struggle in the diaspora need themselves to be part of organizations, you know, to be aligned with some organized structure. You know, that's the way our work is at its most powerful. You know, we can't do too much as individuals. So these are some of the key things, you know, that I would put, you know, at this time. You know, these are some concrete ways that, you know, people, you know, can help this particular struggle.
Thank you. Thank you. This next question is for, I guess, any or all of the presenters. Can you speak to the role of Israel, AFRICOM, and US interventions in the name of security and counterterrorism often seem to incorporate Israel on various levels and seek to further normalize relations with Israel across the continent. So I'll let you all get a chance to speak to that. Aziz, would you like to start?
Well, this is again one of the very sensitive issue that not often mentioned, as it touched the Arab world, the Palestinian question, what is happening today in Syria and what is happening today in Libya, what we can call a Syrianization of the Libyan crisis. And the fact that, you know, Israel has an important role when it comes to intelligence, when it comes to protecting head of states. You know, a lot of head of states in Africa are under the, you know, let us say, intelligence support of the Mossad and so on. So it has been a long process, but again, a lot of people fear the might of Israel on the ground. But I think it's mainly its main ally. It's the main ally of the United States. And here the real aim is to defend the self-determination of the Palestinian, to explain the situation of that we may understand of countries like Egypt and so on. But here the real godfather is the United States. Without the United States, Israel cannot behave in total impunity like it did in the past years. You know, some countries like Cameroon or other cannot sustain without the Israeli support. And this is at the stage where we are, our knowledge, but it's a very active country, more discreet than most of these other players. And there is obviously another issue, which is the issue of racism against the Jews, which is always used to actually hide the bellicist imperialist position of Israel in the continent and elsewhere. But I think we should not confuse the question of Judaity and Jews with the question of Israel regarding this matter.
Great, thank you. Elias, did you want to speak to that as well? Or anyone else? Or Elias, did you want to say anything about the relationship with Israel and AFRICOM? I think the mute button's at the bottom of this screen.
Oh, okay. I agree, basically. I mean, Israel is the super cop of the United States in the Middle East. Huh? So it is always there in Africa. Right now, for example, as the brother speaker from the Congo was speaking about his country, the Congo is rich in resources and there's a lot of looting and plunder there. Huh? They have unleashed a situation of chaos there, and Israel and Israeli firms are beneficiaries in this illicit looting of strategic minerals from the Congo. But this kind of thing has been going on for a long time. And, you know, we have to bear in mind also this juncture, Arab nationalism, at least the progressive Arab nationalism that was there in the time of Jamal Abdel Nasser is extremely weakened. The Arab nation is weakened. So just like African nationalism of the time of Nkrumah, of the Bandung Conference, no longer exists now. We are in a weaker state. The same situation holds in the MENA and the Middle East, North Africa region. And so we are both both the African peoples and the Arab peoples are in a disadvantageous situation, but we have to struggle to unite against this onslaught, and we have to also stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and their right to self-determination.
Thank you, Elias. We're out of time at this point. Thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to Afro-Resistance. Thank you to our interpreters. We really appreciate it. I think this has been a very informative webinar or panel, and we're planning to have another one in September. And I also recommend that you sign up to receive updates from the Black Alliance for Peace as far as their newsletter. That newsletter contains a wealth of great information regarding AFRICOM and US imperialism generally. So I definitely recommend you sign up. But yeah, thank you all for joining us today.